we joined SaaStock a little while ago and are part of their founder circles. It's been absolutely brilliant for us. We first came into it to further our community, our reach, our network, and to learn from some of the world-class speakers that SaaStock has come and speak. And I have to say, it has been absolutely superb for us.
Welcome to the SaaS Revolution Show. I am your host, Alex Theuma, CEO of SaaStock, and delighted to be here today with Natasha Ratanshi-Stein. Welcome, Natasha.
Thanks, Alex. Delighted to be here today.
I omitted the fact that you are the founder and CEO of Surfboard. And actually, I know we'd spoken previously, but I wanted to kind of double check before you came on the podcast that, because sometimes the founder is the CEO or the COO or CTO or many OOs. And it just said founder on LinkedIn, just the founder. So are you, and not saying this in any way, just the founder, but, are you?
Yeah, don't worry, Alex. So I am the founder and CEO. I often associate the title CEO with late stage S&P 500 or FTSE 100 companies. And so I feel like relative to the stage Surfboard's at, which is that we started at the very end of 2020, founder just feels like it's a more applicable title. But I am technically the founder and CEO as well.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, actually, I've heard this before and actually felt it personally. I think for the first couple of years of SaaStock, I was the founder. I didn't feel deserved to be I'm the CEO of a 7-person company.
Exactly.
It's just this is a bit weird. But then I've kind of grown, hopefully, into that, and now I feel that I am the CEO of the business. So it's good stuff. But Natasha, we always kind of start by asking our guests who they are. So I'm going to ask, who is Natasha Ratanshi-Stein?
Yeah, exactly. So apart from being the founder and CEO of Surfboard, I'm Canadian originally. I moved to London 13 years ago. I have not picked up any form of the accent. I have no idea why. I think I just have a really strong West Coast North American accent. I studied at the London School of Economics. I then started working at Goldman Sachs in their mergers and acquisitions team before leaving to join a venture capital fund called Piton Capital, focused on investing in online businesses that benefit from network effects. So I spent 5 years as a VC and then spending more and more time with founders, but also experienced operators. I had this itch to become an operator. And so I joined a company called Bulb, which at the time was one of the fastest growing companies in Europe in the renewable energy space, adding about 40,000 domestic properties per week as customers. I joined as chief of staff, and so naturally, in a generalist role, ended up helicoptered into various functions within the organization. And the first function I went into was the customer support team. And so with the hyper growth Bulb was experiencing at the time, the biggest challenge they had was scaling the support team in accordance with the growth in customer numbers. And so what that meant practically was that long email backlogs, long phone wait times, inability to provide really efficient channels like live chat. And so I went in to diagnose and ultimately come up with solutions to that problem, which is where I stumbled across the problem of Surfboard, and then left the company about 2 years later and ultimately scratched yet another itch to start Surfboard.
Very cool. Thanks for that. Yes, I mean, I was going to say you haven't lost the Canadian or the West Coast sort of accent, but I guess in London that's quite possible because it's probably it's such a cosmopolitan city. You're probably hanging around with a lot of international people. Maybe you need to hang around with more Cockney sort of East,
so.
Proper East End sort of folks. And around the chief of staff, just a comment on that, because actually it's as you said, it's quite a generalist role, but it's a really good stepping stones to understand how to be a CEO, right? And getting that, I guess, experience to be a future CEO. So for anybody, who is kind of perhaps looking, to run a company, be a CEO one day, and you're kind of at that kind of earlier stage and thinking about career, maybe being, if you're lucky enough to be chief of staff at a company, you'll get so much experience, right?
Yeah, I definitely recommend it. I think it's a combination of two things. Number one, you deal with a lot of the really high leverage aspects relating to running a company, things like fundraising, making sure metrics are on track. management structure, making sure the senior leadership team is functioning properly. But then you also end up jumping into specific functions or starting new functions as and when required. So apart from the work I did on customer support, I ended up heading the risk and regulatory function for a few months. And then when the pandemic hit and we started worrying about customers canceling direct debits and inability to pay, I scaled the revenue assurance function. And so apart from like the high leverage, what does a CEO do? How do you support them on that? You also become a very effective like operator and doer. And when you are a CEO, you are doing a lot of things. So it's good prep for that.
So you worked at this hyper-growth, large-scale company, Bulb, identified a problem around customer success. That kind of, I guess, gave birth to the idea of Surfboard. Can you just give us a little bit more sort of insight into the founding story? So you had the idea. How do you take it from idea to, hey, I've got a company now, I'm running a company?
Yeah, there was quite a long journey for me in doing that, just because I stumbled across the idea super early in my journey at Bulb, and I wasn't quite ready to leave Bulb, and I knew that Bulb was having this problem. I wasn't certain that it was a problem that scaled across many other organizations. And so there were a couple things. Number one, while in my role at Bulb, one thing that I also did to understand just how to tackle this problem of scaling a customer support team was I spent a lot of time speaking to other support leaders at hypergrowth companies, whether it was Revolut or Monzo. We also spent a day going to see the DVLA in Swansea. And so for anyone who's not in the UK, the DVLA issues driver's licenses, government agency that's responsible for that, and watched how they had run their support team. So did a lot of research from the perspective of improving Bulb's processes. And that's when I realized this wasn't just a Bulb problem. It was something that whether you were a startup, a scale-up, a government agency, a very established, more legacy business, was something that was uniformly experienced. I then actually, in my case, I went on holiday to Israel and I was staying with a friend who was working at Instacart, and he was a data scientist at Instacart, and he was working the whole holiday. And I asked why he was doing that, and he said, oh, because we use this legacy workforce management system that doesn't do its job properly, so I have to keep updating and putting new data in there so that our support team can run properly. And I was like, we have this problem. I'm hearing this problem from all sorts of companies in the UK. It's quite interesting in real time watching somebody at a company completely across the pond in a completely different industry doing this as well. And so I think that was probably the impetus for me to start taking it seriously. And that's when I went from, research from the purpose of improving Bulb's processes to research to how do you identify what the crux of the problem is, and then start thinking about what the solution looks like from that perspective. And once I felt sufficiently validated, I decided to leave Bulb and start the company. I think the other thing I would mention is that I was never inspired to start something that was just a better UX alternative to the incumbents that are already out there. For me, there was also a trigger around the pandemic and when people started working in different ways, whether it was hybrid or at home, or you saw this yearn for greater flexibility, but also more and more complaints around intrusive surveillance. And so for me, it was the lack of humanity in the way that the industry that Surfboard is operating in was dealt with prior to the creation of Surfboard. That was okay, it's not just about attaching a nicer way or a nicer look and feel or modernizing the fundamental specific nuances for the way software in this industry exists. It's about actually thinking about the problem from a first principles approach and recognizing that the ways of working that software forces upon companies aren't necessarily appropriate for what you would expect today in a support team.
And what data can you share about the company?
Yeah. So as I said, started the company in December 2020. We raised a pre-seed round right from the get-go. I started as a solo founder, so spent the bulk of 2021 building out a team, validating the data science models that go into building Surfboard without actually building the UX and the UI that the companies would interact with today. We started working with a set of 5 design partner customers in order to access the data, understand how it's categorized, build and validate those data science models. Once we felt good about those data science models, we started building the product that is now live, and that went live in May this year, so just a few months ago. We have just over 20 companies using the product. You see it across industries like e-commerce, mobility, insurance and fintech, healthcare, and a couple others. And then per company, you see about 40 to 60 active users across the managers, but also what we call the surfers, who would traditionally be called customer service agents or associates.
Just around the verticals, so you mentioned a few or just different industries that you serve. Often kind of early on, kind of narrow down on like one particular kind of industry. Can you tell us like if you've done that or why you haven't done that? Yeah, it'd be interesting.
Yeah, for us, it's a little bit of like a 2x2 of the ideal industry being an industry that has high volumes of support in a standardized industry where the support queries tend to be across like a limited set of topics, and also in industries where support queries have high urgency. And urgency is important because that's what the impetus is for a company to make sure that they get their workforce management or their team planning and the orchestration layer really nailed, because it's costly if you don't from an SLA perspective or a retention perspective or cost perspective.
It can be sometimes as well. I mean, I've seen it there whereby the company kind of starts out, you're actually trying to think about maybe what is the industry that best served. But you see like, okay, well, like 10 legal companies have bought the product. And so, well, actually, well, there's something here, and this, narrow down into the ICP and kind of take it from there, right? And really kind of, so double down on one particular industry, right? So sometimes that's the case.
Yeah, one thing I would add about Surfboard, and I think maybe the timing under which Surfboard started and the timing we're in now, is that when we started at the end of 2020 or started thinking about who our ideal customer profile was in 2021 and 2022, the dominant industry where we were getting inbounds were industries like e-commerce and venture-backed businesses in the consumer space. I think potentially, given my background starting at Goldman and then venture, I'm very hyper aware of macroeconomic cycles and very keen to make sure we diversify beyond ones that are maybe a little bit more volatile and subject to what happens with inflation and a cost of living crisis. And so when I think about like that 2x2 of urgency and volume being the triggers for where a customer is most relevant to us, I mean, I look at industries like locksmiths or industries like debt collection agencies or those travel agencies where you have to call and cancel and people are using them regularly. And I think what's really important is that for us, it's about making sure we get a company when they are reaching the problem of scaling out of spreadsheets for orchestrating their team, but also making sure that they're an industry where, from a business hygiene perspective for Surfboard, we're not at the mercy of a specific industry experiencing whatever happens with the macroeconomic shocks.
It makes sense. A sound strategy, certainly given, the current climate. And so obviously it's a young company, Surfboard, as you said, like, kind of less than 2 years old, really. What are then, given the time frame that the company's been around, sort of, a couple of the key lessons that you have that you can share from building Surfboard to date?
Yeah, I think given the experience that I had at Bulb, seeing the legacy incumbents in our industry, and also like newer ones that I don't necessarily think are fully solving the customer problem, I think the biggest thing is to resist the temptation of just listening to what customers say verbatim or trying to reach feature parity with what's out there. I think, like, as I said, with what I learned in the pandemic around thinking about new ways of working, it really takes extensive user research in owning the customer problem and making sure that you're problem-centric as opposed to jumping to solutions. I think when you're spending time selling a lot, it can be really easy just to bend over backwards for whatever customers say are missing or what they're looking for, because you have to remember that they've been influenced by whoever's out there already who is telling them a specific way of working is best. And so it's really important that you provide them with a viable alternative to that, but making sure that you're focusing on what is the fundamental problem they have, not what is the solution they're educated on. I think related to that, there's only so much I as a founder can diagnose when it comes to the problem. And so I think what that means at the early stage is hire people who are extremely product centric and By that, I mean product engineers. And that doesn't need to be in their job title, but you should definitely vet for that when you're interviewing them, is how do they interact in their questions around understanding the problem? How do they interact in understanding usage and engagement, and what potential customers want versus what potential customers' behavior looks like? And then I guess another thing is just like design. I think we at Surfboard have invested a lot in design really early on. Of our first 10 employees, 3 of them were in the design team. And by doing that, we really could be very problem focused as opposed to jumping to specific solutions.
Thanks for sharing that. And you're a solo founder without a technical background. What advice would you give to others in your position that are just starting out?
Yeah, I think number one, you obviously need a really solid CTO. And by a solid CTO, they have to be a solid engineer who has the willingness and the ability to build things themselves, not just want to get into, architecture and team building. But then they also have to be able to have the long-term view over architecture and team building. And when it comes to team building, they have to have gravitas and charisma to be able to hire a team around them. Because ultimately, when you are a team that has to hire engineers and data scientists and designers, they want to make sure that they're drawn to a CTO who really can guide them down the right path. And so in my case, I was really lucky that 5 months after we raised the round and effectively started Surfboard, I met Matt Schofield, who had previously co-founded a business called Credit Kudos. That sold to Apple earlier this year, but got along well with Matt, and he was quite keen to go to a business that was at effectively day zero again, and we were very aligned in that. I think the second thing is that you really have to trust people. As a solo founder, I think mentally the biggest challenge is that you always have this thing in your head telling you, like, nobody's ever going to care as much as you do. And to some degree, like, it can be true, but the people who join an early stage business tend to be missionaries, not mercenaries. And you do have to hand over trust to them, especially in their respective departments, because they've joined you for a reason. You've hired them for a reason. And so you can't micromanage or control everything. And then I think standardizing processes is probably the third thing, relating to like what sits in your head, but making sure that's scalable. And so for me personally, setting high standards across the board is something I care about a lot, because some people might say that, you got to 80-20 it, but I have a personal hypothesis that if you 80-20 it, the 20% that is low standards is going to start dripping into the 80% where it really matters. And so I think an example I use is that on Slack, I get really irritated if like there's typos or gratuitous exclamation marks, or even Slack communications don't match our tone of voice that we want at Surfboard. And the reason for that is pretty simple, is that we also Slack our customers. So if we're slacking internally sloppily, it's going to take no time before that starts leaking to external communication to customers. So I think like those are the 3 things that give me peace of mind. But as a solo founder, there's definitely a lot of challenges you have. It certainly feels lonely sometimes, but the only way to offset that is by really making sure that you do trust your team, that you hire people around you that have the gravitas and the experience that they're deserving of your trust, and that whatever is in your head, you try to institutionalize in your organization as much as possible.
We had a question a few weeks ago from a SaaStock founder member, and he was asking about where can you meet CTOs, right? Where do you go to meet CTOs? You met Matt, sort of, as you say, like I think like 5 months in. Where did you meet him?
Yeah, so I got really lucky that Matt, I actually came across his profile on Otta, but at the same time, our pre-seed investor, Fly Ventures, one of the partners, had known him from when Matt started Credit Kudos at Entrepreneur First. I think the best place is obviously through your network. I cold outreached so many people on LinkedIn. It would definitely be like probably in the hundreds and hundreds, and met a ton of people from various levels, from, senior software engineer to tech lead to staff engineer to CTO at other companies. In that process, I was really lucky that the gentleman who was CTO at checkout.com at the time, called Riaz, he kindly responded, and he was like, look, I'm not looking to move from Checkout right now, but really happy to be an advisor. And I would say that when you're a solo founder, you're not technical, it's really hard for you to vet talent of engineers. And so having somebody who is willing to be an advisor, who is willing to spend the time interviewing candidates for you, really helps you set aside the good and the great, or the good and the not so good.
The cold outreach was worth it. So in the end, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually think cold outreach always works out.
And did you say Otter? Or
yeah, I did. Yeah.
What is that? I've not heard of this before. What's the website?
It's a job marketplace. Companies go on, post jobs, candidates are on there across like all sorts of roles, from commercial to technical to.
Okay, and that's like the animal otter, is it, or spelled differently? OTT, okay, yeah, gotcha. All right, good stuff. And obviously, when we had like a pre-call around this, something that you're really passionate about is about building a brand, and building a brand kind of early, right? Both for your customers and potential future customers, and for the team as well. So I'm going to start with when and why should a SaaS startup build a brand? So yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think when is as soon as possible. The second you start the company, you should start thinking about brand building. When you think about consumer-facing businesses, like the inception of Nike or anything in that category, they think it's in their DNA. It's what enables them to succeed. In B2B, I think people end up thinking way too much about functionality and not enough about the brand. When B2B buyers, whilst they're buying for a company, it's the same people who buy, Nike shoes or whatever. And so you do have to connect with their emotional needs, not just their, tactical or functional needs. I would say, in my case, the first blog I wrote was why we're starting Surfboard. And it was very much that story of, I've experienced a problem. The problem is terrible. I speak your language. We're building you the tool that I wish we had when we were scaling a support team at Bulb. And off the back of that, A, it's good for hiring. B, we had prospective customers start reaching out being like, hey, I'm really excited about what you're doing. It's how we ended up getting design partners that were willing to give us, access to their Zendesk or their Intercom and be very supportive in user testing and user research. And then C, obviously for the purpose of hiring, is that if you don't talk about why you're doing what you're doing or building that brand around it, it's really hard from like a functional perspective to get somebody who's interested in joining, who isn't going to be, I guess for lack of a better term, a mercenary. Like, you at this stage really want to hire missionaries, and I don't know how you bring missionaries on board if you're not investing in brand and storytelling. I guess I think quite a few of us have read Sapiens, and at the crux of humankind, it's our most basic instinct, and it's why we as humans have evolved the way we do.
Coincidentally, I recorded a podcast earlier today with Alina Vandenberg, who's the co-CEO of Chili Piper. They were founded in 2016. Today they're doing 30 million in ARR. And I wouldn't say it was not a regret, but a learning for her was to invest in brand earlier, because they spent so much time on product. And speaking to you and the listeners are probably thinking, well, 30 million ARR is a pretty good business, right? I'll take that. And most of us would, me included. But she believed that had she invested in brand earlier, they'd be much further ahead. And they're only really just starting to, invest in brand over the last sort of year or maybe two. So, yeah, just kind of timely, given that we're having this conversation. And Alina mentioned that as the kind of one area that, they were very product focused, but not enough on the brand side of things as well. So
absolutely. Yeah. I think what I would say about Chili Piper and also Surfboard is the commonality is also unique names in the industry that don't necessarily apply to, a function within the product. And I think that also just allows you to build a brand around just what you've called yourself. And so while I don't doubt what she said, I'm sure there was a little bit more like implicit brand thinking early on, even at inception when they called themselves Chili Piper.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I mean, they came up with their own hot sauce as part of the brand play. And I mean, what you're going to come up with something around surfboards or something surf related, I'm sure, as well. And like, given that you've had this obsessive focus on building brand that connects with customers, how have you really gone about building brand? The specific examples, and what are the tangible results?
Yeah. So number one is building a community around what you do and really differentiating between what is for the purpose of direct sales and acquisition and what is for the broader community. One stat that I obsess with is that at any point in time of your addressable market, only 5% of them are going to be buying. And so do you just ignore the 95%? I don't think so. And that's where brand building comes in. I mean, I guess like there's that quote that Coca-Cola doesn't advertise on billboards because you're going to go and buy Coca-Cola right away. But when you are thirsty, you'll remember Coca-Cola. And I think it's the same thing with the B2B buyer journey. And so from that capacity, what we really invest in is community building that isn't necessarily just about Surfboard, but relates to any topic that relates to scaling a customer support team. And so for us, that means we do weekly blog posts. We also do weekly webinars. On our webinars, we feature people who are within our community. So whether it's our customers, whether it's our partners, whether it's us talking about our own experiences of scaling a customer support team, we're quite deliberate that unless it's a feature release related webinar, all of our other webinars are just about the topic. They're not intended to plug Surfboard. We really want to do what's best for our community and provide value to them in less tangible ways than measuring conversion to, booking a demo and then converting to a customer. I think the second thing is we use brand to think about how we inject personality into our product. And so again, like being really granular in my examples, we invested in getting an illustrator really on. And so with that illustrator, we use the themes of waves, of animals underwater. And so when you're waiting for your schedule to load on Surfboard, you have this like happy fish looking at a computer as that's generating. And again, like it's about connecting to the emotional needs, not just the functional needs of a potential customer. And then I think the final thing is simplifying how you communicate what you do. I think for most B2B companies, it's rare to hear that you're in an environment that has no competitors. And so then you have to very succinctly describe to yourself, to your team, and to your potential customers in the market that you operate in, how do you differentiate? And we took a lot of inspiration from government digital services when they said we're simpler, faster, and better. And that started getting picked up by the equivalent of government digital service globally. And so we said, what are our 3 words? And we're simpler, we're smarter, which means that we fully automate the end-to-end process, and we're fairer. And that reflects our approach to shift planning, diversity, and scheduling. But it helps us use those 3 words to inform what we communicate externally, but how we prioritize things internally.
It's a great point you mentioned about just the proliferation of, SaaS companies that there are in every like vertical sort of these days, right? So I think competition, is certainly one of the biggest challenges for a SaaS company to be really kind of like stand out amongst the 50 or 100 or 1,000 of other SaaS products that are probably doing something very similar to you. And that's really kind of why you've got to start thinking about, building brand, kind of early, and too many think about it too late. But to really kind of stand out, why should I buy X over Y? If you connect with that brand, the personality, the CEO, the founder, etc., the webinars you've been attending, that is going to really kind of hold some credence, right?
Totally. And it also comes down to standardization. Like I think at this point, it's easy for me to get on a sales conversation and for me to say, oh, I've lived and breathed your experience, therefore you should buy Surfboard. I mean, one day, hopefully, if Surfboard's successful, it's not just going to be me. It's going to be a lot of other people doing that. And you can't scale just me doing it, but you can scale having a brand where everybody associates Surfboard with a certain set of principles. And those principles are embedded in our product, how we communicate, how we sell, how we host things for the environment that we live in that have nothing to do with selling. And I think that that comes down to building a brand.
When Surfboard is successful. Surfboard is successful. And you also mentioned around missionaries versus mercenaries. So how has building a brand sort of like helped you with hiring?
Yeah, I think with building a brand, it's come down to a few different things. Number one is being able to communicate. I mean, when I say simpler, smarter, fairer, making sure that when we hire, it's not just our brand principles, but it's how we operate as a company. How do they think about simplicity? How do they think about intelligence and automation? How do they think about fairness and, making the world of scheduling and workforce planning a lot more human? And trying to make sure we hire people that identify very closely with our brand, but our broader mission. I think the second thing is translating the brand values and the company values into our operational values. And so things like keeping it simple aren't just how we build our product, it's also how we communicate internally. Like everything has to be start with a point. One of our values is zero faff. And so that means that if we have something in our product, or we have something in writing, or we have a specific meeting or process that we don't think is necessary, it gets binned really quickly. And so that's something that we really test for in hiring, but it's also something that when we do performance reviews, the team is assessed against those set of values, but then how do they fit into the specific brand? And finally, when I think about product engineers, the fish that I described that appears when you're generating the schedule, that was an idea by one of our engineers who said, we have a lot of brand and personality on our website, and when we talk about what we're doing, how do we make sure that's visible when somebody's actually in Surfboard's product as well? So it's not just for sales and marketing, and it's the end-to-end experience from sales, marketing, onboarding, customer success, usage, retention, everything else.
To summarize, what are your key takeaways on building a brand before we move into the quick fire questions?
Yeah, I think number one is that sometimes venture capitalists can be obsessed with category definition. I wouldn't obsess over that because building a brand is arguably much more important. Like, I mean, if I think about the Coca-Cola example, there's other pops, they exist. Coca-Cola has invested in building a brand around sodas and, carbonated drinks. I think with software businesses, that's even more important because you don't have the first mover advantage in many cases that Coca-Cola has. And Frank Slootman in Amp It Up really advocates that you don't think about redefining a category that already exists because then you're effectively pushing water uphill. But what you can do is really make sure that when you talk about differentiation, that's the most important messaging that comes across, so that, in our case, somebody's looking for scheduling or workforce management software. There's no reason we have to start calling it team orchestration software, which is what we would prefer to call it as, because somebody's looking for a specific category of software. But what we can do is use simpler, smarter, and fairer to describe why we're different from what's already out there.
No, great advice, and also great book, Amp It Up, and Frank Slootman doing great things with Snowflake. I think, interesting as well that there was, and maybe there still is, this huge buzz from VCs about category creation and the book Play Bigger. And, I think certainly like last couple of years, it's all about category creation. I haven't seen so much this year on that. So I don't know if the trend is changing or are they still, I guess, advocating for that?
Yeah, I don't know. I think the problem with being in an existing category is that specifically when you're speaking to VCs, they then look at what's already out there and often have like a checklist of, okay, this is your product roadmap based on the category that's out there. I think the conversation tends to be a lot easier with customers because, as I said, customers are already looking for that category of software and they already know what the hook within that product suite is. They know what the bells and whistles are versus what the core feature of that is. And so, you end up having to think about the conversations you have with potential investors very differently from the conversations you have with potential customers. And obviously customers live and breathe what you're doing. So that tends to be an easier conversation.
Let's move into the quickfire questions. So what one thing has moved the needle the most for Surfboard?
Yeah, investing in design. I think, like I talked earlier about owning the problem, and investing in design has definitely been probably the most effective thing we've done.
What's the best advice you have ever received?
The best advice I ever received was when I was an incoming analyst at Goldman Sachs, and the COO of the business at the time spoke to the incoming analyst class and said, the best way to judge someone is to see how they treat somebody they don't need anything from. And as I started applying that advice to my personal life, my professional life, I think I was really able to better surround myself with really great people.
Good advice indeed. What's your biggest failure and lesson learned?
Good question. I think it probably relates to the inverse of what's moved the needle most. And I think it's like taking quite literally what prospective customers say they want without going those layers deeper and really diagnosing the problem.
What's the hardest thing about being a CEO?
The work never ends. And so you have to inorganically create boundaries for yourself. I think it's really easy to say, okay, I'll focus on myself once the dust settles on fundraising, or I'll focus on myself once the dust settles on onboarding. The dust never settles, and so you have to just make sure that you carve that time for yourself.
Yeah, that's definitely true. What about your daily routine? So given that work never ends and it is a tough job being a CEO, what does your daily routine look like, and how does that kind of help optimize you for, the work ahead and the day ahead?
Yeah, so unlike, I guess, a lot of great CEOs, I'm not a super early riser. I do make sure I get to inbox zero by 9:30, so I try to not have any meetings first thing in the morning so that I can get my inbox under control. I divide my week based on meetings and no meetings days, and internal versus external. So Mondays and Wednesdays are for external meetings. Tuesdays and Thursdays are for internal meetings and brainstorming sessions. Fridays, I try to have as minimal meetings as possible, just to use that as focus time. And then I guess relating to what I said around carving time for yourself, it's really, really hard to do it. And the best way to do it is to find avenues where you don't have your phone within reach. And so I used to competitive swim when I was in high school. I try to swim 4 times a week now. It's obviously great for, your body and like your physical health, but I mostly do it because you can't physically access a phone when you're in a swimming pool.
Yeah. And also, I guess, as you say, like mentally when you're swimming, probably very difficult to think about work. I haven't really been, swimming for exercise for a long time, but I find there's certain things, maybe, I think yoga for one, and maybe like a brutal kind of workout with a personal trainer or something like that. You just can't really think about work and you switch off, and that does give you space. But I find if I like jump on the Peloton, I can drift into work like super easy on that.
So I'm a good swimmer, which sounds like a flex, but it's not, which means that like I can do it quite naturally and think about work. So you almost, I sound a bit like, like I torture myself doing this, but one way to combat that is to go to an unheated swimming pool, because you need that like focus on survival that gets you to stop thinking about work.
Very good. Very good. Okay, so you're speaking at SaaStock 2022 this October, 17th to the 19th. Excited to have you come to Dublin. Do you know what you're speaking about?
Yeah.
And you can share that. And what are you looking forward to as well?
Yeah, so I actually haven't been to Dublin for a really long time. I'm super excited. It's the first pure SaaS conference that I'll have been to. And so really excited to meet other founders and people within the ecosystem. I am speaking about scaling customer support and success teams. Obviously, you have support teams in every industry possible, but within SaaS, it's particularly important because you have the nuance of really being able to use support teams to diagnose product queries that are coming in, product defects, prioritize your roadmap a lot better by really using your support and your success teams to understand usage, retention, troubleshooting, and also clarify your ideal customer profile. Because I think it's one thing for a sales team to go out and say like, these are the people who are resonating best with our value proposition. But then you sometimes create a downstream problem where they come in and then the usage isn't as expected. And so, speaking about scaling and leveraging the support team across an organization and really treating it as a revenue driver, not a cost center.
Awesome. Looking forward to that. And of course, meeting you, in person in Dublin. So it's going to be a lot of fun. And finally, what is your favorite business book and what are you currently reading?
Yeah, I guess I've cited Frank Slootman earlier in this conversation, so it would be a sin for me to not say Amp It Up. Look, I think like The Hard Thing About Hard Things is probably one that gets quoted a lot, but practically, like I end up rereading a lot of chapters as I endure the problems that he describes in it. So both of those are ones that I have post-it notes and constantly come back to frequently. I'm currently reading The Italians by John Hooper. It is an account of the micro structures within Italian societies, whether it's the family, the church, the interest in food, the mobs in Italy. I've heard he also wrote a book called The Spaniards, so I'll probably read that after.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah. I read Amp It earlier this year, I'm pretty sure, and really enjoyed that. And Frank's directness as well, so it's very good. Where can people find you online, Natasha, if obviously they're going to hopefully see you in person, or if they're coming to SaaStock in Dublin, but where can they find you online?
Really only LinkedIn. I wish I was the type of person that's on Twitter, but I'm just not witty enough, unfortunately. So Natasha Ratanshi-Stein on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Good stuff. Well, Natasha Ratanshi-Stein, thanks so much for being a great guest on the SaaS Revolution Show today and sharing with the SaaStock audience. Look forward to seeing you in October in Dublin at SaaStock 2022. Thanks so much once again for being a great guest on the SaaS Revolution Show.
Thanks for having me, Alex.